Hi everyone. Well, today we are going to work on the 5.04 lesson called Seeking Perfection. And I'm going to read through the lesson, introduction here, and then we'll go to the textbook and read that in the textbook. The United States was changing in the early 19th century. So 19th century, we're talking about the early 1800s. Most Americans believed the changes were good for the country, but the rapid growth of industry in cities brought hardship and problems as well as prosperity. Optimistic that they could improve the nation, reformers organized to confront these new social problems. This age of reform had roots in religious faith and was centered on the belief in the perfectibility of the individual and society. Reform efforts range from the utopian movements to attempts to combat poverty, crime, and ignorance. All right, so today, as you may have become aware after that introduction, we're going to be reading about reform movements. So we're going to be identifying problems that were coming up in society and people and leaders and what they wanted to do to change those problems. So what we need to do today is begin by reading pages 328 through 341. So now we're going to switch to the online textbook. And we see here in the beginning the page that we need to be on. Okay, let me see. Let's get that. Turn the page. And it's still the introduction. Turn the page again. An age of reform. Once idealized as a shining city upon a hill or a peaceful agrarian republic, agrarian means farming, America in the 19th century was becoming a much more complicated place. As young men and women left the farm and as waves of immigrants crossed the Atlantic, cities grew rapidly. So did their problems, including overcrowding and disease and filthy tenements. Tenements are apartment buildings, and a surge of violent crime. In the North, factory workers endured grueling 12-hour days, while in the South, the brutal slave system spread as the cotton economy expanded into new states such as Alabama and Mississippi. On both sides of the North-South divide, women increasingly spoke up only to be told to sit down. Even as they continued to view their republic as a land of opportunity, many Americans worried about the new challenges confronting them. In the first half of the 19th century, a determined group of reformers set out to tackle these social problems. Many of them came from the Northeast, especially New England. Theirs was the first region to industrialize and the first region to confront the new urban problems. A lot of these things happening, those movers and shakers were coming from New England. That's pretty common since that was the first area that was settled in the New World. Many reformers emerged from new or newly energized religious movements. They shared a sense of optimism about the perfectibility of human society. They profited from the transportation and communications revolution that allowed them to spread their word. They also benefited from the new availability of middle-class white women to work for their causes. Reformers argued, gave speeches, wrote editorials, went to jail, and sometimes risked their lives all in the hope of righting what they considered wrong. Some were to eliminate pauperism and illiteracy. Some advocated sobriety and thrift. Others fought to end slavery or to gain rights for women. Because of this widespread effort to improve self and society, the decades from the early 1800s to the 1850s in the United States have been called an age of reform. Starting with the Second Great Awakening. Back in the 1730s and 1740s, colonists of varying denominations, that's different religions, were caught up in a revival of religious fervor called the Great Awakening. In the early 1800s, the American religious landscape changed in ways that reflected the new democratic optimism of the period. Remember, we were talking about the era of good feelings in the early 1800s in a previous unit, where political differences kind of go off to the side for a little bit, so that ties into this new democratic optimism. The religious revival known as the Second Great Awakening peaked in the 1820s and lasted to the 1840s. Tens of thousands of people embraced various forms of evangelical Christianity, which emphasized personal conversion, fervent worship, and earnest moral striving. The Methodist and Baptist denominations in particular gained many new members during this time. Many religiously motivated reformers sought both individual renewal and the perfection of society. They agitated against idleness, drunkenness, and not keeping the Sabbath, all of which they condemned as sinful. In the North, religious reformers tried to solve social problems in the cities and took a hard stand against slavery. In western New York, where new canals and roads connected once isolated communities to eastern markets, evangelical zeal burned particularly strong, leading some contemporary observers to label the area the burned-over district. Here, various sects completed to recruit new members from a population made up of many immigrants, Catholics, and others whom the evangelicals were eager to convert. In 1821, an attorney named Charles Grandison Finney abandoned his law practice to become a revivalist. From the burned-over district of western New York, he traveled across the northeast of the Midwest, preaching to all who would listen. Thousands attended his massive outdoor revivals, which could go on for weeks. Finney's dramatic preaching style excited the crowds, who regularly burst into shouting, singing, and weeping. In the 1830s, the leader of Rochester, New York, a town that had grown rapidly in response to trade on the Erie Canal, invited Finney to preach against the evils that had come with prosperity, particularly drunkenness. In a crusade that lasted some 6 months, Finney persuaded many converts to reform their ways and lead sober, pious lives. So that's the temperance movement. To combat drunkenness, it's called the temperance movement. That's going to be something we're going to read more about. Like other evangelical ministers in the early 19th century, Finney stressed that people could, of their own free will, turn to God, choose a righteous life, and thus be saved. Whereas Americans' Puritan forefathers had believed in predestination, Finney and other new revivalists believed that men and women had the capacity to choose between good and evil. In the First Great Awakening during the early 18th century, Jonathan Edwards voiced the Puritan view of mankind as sinful and depraved. According to Edwards, it did not matter, however you may have reformed your life in many things, you are in the hands of an angry God. But in the Second Great Awakening, revivalists preached that people could choose goodness, and if they did, God would save them. Instead of telling sinners to pray for a new heart, Finney recalled, we called on them to make themselves a new heart. Here we go. So, Second Great Awakening, that people can be good and God will save you. This will tie into the Reform movement. This belief in spiritual self-determination fit in well with the new American reality. In a democratic country that offered vastly expanded opportunities for political participation, though limited still to white men, and where ordinary people could rise or fall by their own talents, many Christians believed they could secure their own salvation through working to reform both their lives and the evils of society. By some estimates, 3 out of 4 Americans in the 1830s were church-going Christians, though not all were evangelical. Other religious groups such as Quakers and Unitarians also considered reform an obligation of their faith. Quakers emphasized human equality and the inner light of God present in each person. Consequently, many felt especially obligated to speak out against slavery and to provide refuge for slaves escaping to freedom. Unitarians, based mainly in New England, emphasized the basic goodness of humanity. They looked at Jesus Christ not as a divine being, but as a teacher, leader, and model of moral perfection. I'm just going to skip now down to the Mormons. The religious fervor of the time led as well to the creation of new sects. In the burned-over district in western New York, a denomination emerged known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The followers of this new faith, called Mormons, responded to the teachings of the church's founder, Joseph Smith. In September 1823, Smith was an 18-year-old farm boy who had religious visions. In one vision, Smith recalled, an angel named Moroni appeared before him and told him, in Smith's words, that God has work for me to do, and that my name shall be had for good and evil among all nations, kindreds, and tongues. He said there was a book deposited, written upon gold plates, giving an account of the former inhabitants of this American continent and the source from whence they sprang. By his account, Smith heeded the angel's call and traveled to a nearby hill where he dug up a stone box containing the plates, as well as tablets that would help him decipher the ancient language of which they were written. The result of these efforts was the Book of Mormon, published in 1830. Smith soon attracted hundreds and thousands of followers to his new religion. According to the Book of Mormon, the American Indians were the descendants of the ancient Israelites, and America was a land of biblical importance. Mormons believed that the second coming would occur somewhere in the Western Hemisphere starting in 1831, they established settlements in Ohio and Missouri with the intention of building the New Zion, or Kingdom of God in the United States. Like other Christian movements associated with the Second Great Awakening, Mormonism reflected the religious fervor of the time. 12 apostles led the new church in its communities. Believers avoided alcohol and tobacco. They openly worked to win converts, both in the United States and abroad. By 1841, they adopted the doctrine of plural marriage, which allowed a man to take more than one wife, and thus placed the Mormons in conflict with American civil authorities. Wherever they went, the Mormons were threatened and sometimes attacked. Other Christians viewed them as dangerous heretics. Smith and his followers were forced to flee Missouri for Illinois. In 1844, while awaiting trial, Smith and his brother Hiram were killed in an angry mob. Smith's successor, Brigham Young, led the Mormons on a long, hard journey westward, where they eventually established a thriving settlement in what is now Utah. And that would be Utah. Salt Lake City would be the first place they settled. The impulse to perfect both self and society led many reformers to attempt to create utopian communities. That is, communities free of social evils, models of a perfect society. Between 1820 and 1850, thousands of Americans left their homes to join utopian communities that sprang up in Indiana, Massachusetts, New York, and elsewhere. At one point, there were more than 100 utopian communities in the United States. Some of these were organized around specific religious convictions. Others were secular in their approach, but all believed in the possibility of creating a perfect society. See here on the side, secular means not related to religious matters. Robert Owen, a successful businessman born in the United States, born in Wales, brought his reform ideas to the United States. He got his start in Britain, where he worked his way up from a factory laborer to a textile manufacturer. He knew from first-hand experience the grim working and living conditions for many factory workers. He resolved to do better by the workers in his factories. Owen was an early utopian socialist. That is, he advocated cooperative, economic, and social arrangements and opposed what he saw as a self-serving competition and gross inequalities in the capitalist industrial system. In 1799, when Owen and his business partners bought the new Lanark textile mills in Scotland, he took bold steps. Owen prohibited labor for children under the age of 10. He set up schools for the young and built better housing for the mill workers. He found that improving workers' living conditions and building schools for their children resulted in an increase in production at his mills. As New Lanark thrived, Owen urged the British government to build villages of unity and mutual cooperation. But the authorities weren't interested in Owen's utopian schemes. So in 1824, Owen set sail for America to seek support for his ideas. Make a man happy and you make him virtuous. That is the whole of my system, Owen told the audiences that crowded to hear him. Owen emphasized the importance of the community. A good community, he said, would produce good people. And here's just a little excerpt about the meaning of utopia. It comes from a pitiful book written in 1516, made up the Greek words meaning no place. In their utopia, an imaginary island governed by reason, nobody is rich or poor, powerful or weak. The citizens cooperate, share, and deal fairly with one another. Everyone has what they need. All work 9 hours a day. For the rest of the day, they're free to do what they like. Not waste their time in idleness or self-indulgence, but to make good use of some congenial activity. And people now use the word utopia to refer to any vision of an ideal society. Sometimes people use the adjective utopian to refer to ideas that some seem impractical or out of reach. So utopia, perfect society, where everyone gets along, cooperates, and has equality, which sounds great, but as you may guess, it's pretty hard to put into practice. To prove his point, Owen went to Indiana to the spring of 1825 and bought thousands of acres of land with several dozen existing buildings. He christened the place New Harmony. Here he said there would be cooperation rather than competition. Workers would share both the labor and the profits. In Owen's vision, all would work in pleasant surroundings for the common good. Hundreds of people flocked to New Harmony. The community thrived briefly but had trouble almost from the start. New Harmony had lodging for only 700 people, but Owen accepted more than 800 into the community. Crowded together, residents squabbled over work assignments, property rights, and methods of government. New Harmony was not a very harmonious place. The community dissolved about 2 years after its creation, and Owen returned to Britain, having poured 80% of his wealth into his noble but failed experiment.